What's up, everybody? Joe Brown here. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and the EPA just got their authority capped at the knees by the Supreme Court. In a new ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA does not have the authority to force power plants to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And in this video, I am going to make some huge enemies here because I'm going to prove unequivocally with extreme clarity why this is, number one, a huge win, a massive step forward for individuals who are seeking prosperity in America, number one, and number two, also a massive win for the environment. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, so the Supreme Court just set limits on the EPA's authority to be able to set climate standards for power plants. This is a massive win for Americans. We're not talking about the environment yet. We are just talking about liberty, individual freedom for people like you and me, and who is allowed to tell us how we are able to live. If we take a look at the ruling, the Supreme Court said that Congress, not the EPA, has the power to create a broad system of cap and trade regulations to limit emissions from existing power plants in a bid to transition away from coal to renewable energy sources. Now, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I made a video about who in America by the Constitution has the power to regulate our lives, to make laws that impact your life and my life. Take a look with me here at what the Constitution says in Article 1, Section 1 about who is able to make laws. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. This is probably one of the most clearly written statements in the entire Constitution, that if somebody is going to make a law, legislate, make regulation, it has to be Congress, Senate, and House. It cannot be any other agency. Congress is not allowed to offload that power and grant that authority for legislation to other agencies, other boards, other groups, or other individuals. The power to create legislation rests solely with Congress. The reason for this is because, number one, they don't have the ability to make laws about everything, right? And that's the justification they've used for creating a lot of these other things like the SEC and the EPA and the ATF in order to just abdicate their responsibilities to the experts. The problem with this is that if Congress doesn't have the expertise or the time to make educated laws about these things, there should not be laws about them. It should be left up either to the states or to cities or to individuals. It should not be federal law. But Congress wanted to create a lot more laws, and they wanted individuals who were experts in those areas to be able to make those laws, and they removed the accountability on creating that legislation to people who are unelected officials, people who are in charge of the SEC and the EPA and the ATF and all of these other boards and agencies that make decisions that affect the everyday lives of everyday Americans. That should rest solely with Congress. And now the Supreme Court ruling has brought some of that back to Congress. In the ruling, again, the Supreme Court said that that power rests with Congress, not the EPA. Now, keep in mind that from the Supreme Court's perspective, this decision was made solely on that basis. If we take a look at what Roberts wrote, he said, capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from coal to generate electricity, it might be a sensible solution to the crisis of the day. However, it's not plausible that Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt it on its own, such a regulatory scheme. So in my opinion, this is a big step in the right direction, not ideal at all, but it's a step in the right direction because they said, hey, Congress needs to do this, not the EPA. It might be the right decision, but the EPA doesn't have the authority to do it. And it's really funny, this dissent by Kagan. Kagan said the court appoints itself instead of Congress or the expert agency, the decision maker on climate policy. I can't think of many things more frightening. It literally did the exact opposite. It assigned that authority to Congress explicitly, which is where the Constitution says that power should lie. Now, it does not go far enough. If you take a look at what this leaves, it does not affect the the EPA's ability to limit greenhouse gas emissions more broadly. It still has the ability to limit greenhouse gases at the source under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act and more broadly through other provisions of the Act. So while this is a step in the right direction, it is not ideal. It does not complete the story. However, restoring the ability to legislate things back to Congress instead of those that they've abdicated their responsibility to is a step in the right direction. So that's number one. Very good thing. But now we have to wonder, okay, well, what about the implications of this? Because many people are looking at this and saying this will result in more pollution, more greenhouse gases, more carbon dioxide emissions, and a worse environment moving forward. So legally, it might be a step in the right direction. But what about the environment? What is the cost on our environment? And that's where I want to show you this is potentially moving us in a great direction here because scientifically speaking, all of the things you've heard about the environment are not as they seem. And this is why I say I'm going to make some enemies here because I'm going to point out some things about carbon dioxide and the environment that are absolute fact that cannot be disputed, but will make some people angry because they look at the world through a very different set of lens. So we've got two lenses that we're going to look at the world through here. Number one, we're going to look at it through the impact lens. Number two, we're going to look at it through the human thriving lens. Now, if you haven't read Fossil Future by Alex Epstein, I highly recommend it. I will link it in the description below, and it details a lot more in detail what we're going to talk about in this video here. But pretty much everything that says, hey, we need to have less of an impact on the environment comes from the standpoint of low impact, meaning anti-human. The end ideal is no human impact on Earth, that Earth should just be let on its own to do whatever it would do without any human interaction whatsoever, which if you follow it through to its conclusion means that the ideal state of Earth is one with zero humans on it, because any human living in any environment on Earth will have some sort of impact, which is an anti-human ideal, meaning that the ideal is zero humans, ending all human life on Earth, which is pure evil. That's it. That's the facts. That's the end ideal of the anti-impact framework is 100% pure evil, end all human life on Earth. That is the goal. That is the ultimate perfect paradise on Earth. The other worldview is human thriving. What is the point of the environment if it is not to serve humans? Otherwise, you end up with the impact framework. And so going through the lens of a human thriving framework, number one, we have to protect our environment. Otherwise, humans won't thrive if we don't have the world, right? So protection is built into that. You've got to keep it, you've got to nurture it, you got to protect it. But number two, the point of doing that is to thrive as humans. So we're supposed to impact our environment. We're supposed to improve it. We're supposed to make it beneficial for our own use. And when we take a look at energy use and wealth, they are so tightly correlated that they are basically the same thing. As humans throughout time have increased the amount of energy we can consume, when we went from no fire to fire, when we went from fire, which is burning biomass, to coal, when we went from coal to fossil fuels, when we went from fossil fuels to introducing nuclear. Every single time we've been able to massively increase the amount of energy we can consume, there is a giant increase in total wealth on Earth for everybody, not just a select few. There are less people today living in extreme poverty than ever before. When we take a look at how tightly correlated energy use is with wealth, it is unequivocally a better thing for more energy to be used, not less. And then you ask, okay, well, what about the impact on the climate, global warming? Eventually, we're not protecting our environment. It'll result in cataclysms and bad weather, things like that. Well, when you consider the amount of resiliency to climate disasters has increased far faster than the impact on our environment, it's not a problem. There are less people, relative percentage-wise, today that die from climate-related disasters than ever before in human history. So if we are having an impact on making the environment more difficult compared to what it was just on an absolute term, it is less difficult to live in on a relative term because we are more resilient to it. Our buildings don't fall down from storms anymore like they used to, like houses used to not be able to survive major storms, and they can now. So all of the plastics and the materials and the machinery machinery and the energy that we have to make our environment, to make ourselves more resilient to our environment, are more than compensate for any increase in the difficulty in living on an absolute term. Now, again, if this angers you, take a step back and think about whether you are looking at that through the lens of impact or human thriving. Because if you're looking at this from the lens of human impact, then that's a bad thing for you. You don't want humans to impact the environment. You want it to be natural and untouched. And therefore, the ideal would be all human life on Earth to end, to die, zero humans. But if you're looking at it through the lens of humans thriving, then this is a good thing. Who cares if the environment is a little bit different than it would be absent human interaction? If it's causing humans to thrive more and we are able to interact with our environment in a way that causes us more benefit than harm, that is a good thing, not a bad thing. We're supposed to protect and improve our environment. That is the role of humans. Keep it, protect it, nurture it on one hand, and on the other hand, improve it, make it beneficial for us. And now we're going to get into the third point here, which is going to blow up probably everything you've ever heard about carbon dioxide, greenhouse, climate change, global warming, because it is just not true. And this is where I'll probably make the most enemies here. All right, what is oil? Where did oil come from? Oil is biomass. It is an organic material that came from plants and animals that were buried under the earth, that through time and pressure and heat turns that biomass into oil. So that's the first thing we have to understand. It's not an inorganic material. It's something that came from plant and animal life. At one point in our Earth's history was buried and turned it into oil over time. So that's the first thing to recognize. Following that conclusion, that means that at one time, all of that oil existed as plant and animal life on top of the ground. It was plant and animal life on the earth at one time. It was not always underneath the earth as oil. Now, second question, what are plants made out of? When you look at a plant, you plant a tree, you watch it grow. Where does that mass come from? There's a couple options. Number one, it could come from the dirt, right? The second option, it could come from water, right? Some people, when they're asked this, they say sunlight, but sunlight doesn't have mass. It's just energy. So that's not where the mass comes from. If you, the third option there is that it comes from the air. So of those three options, without looking it up, take your guess. Do you think that the mass from a plant comes from the ground, the water, or the air? Comes from the air. I think it's 98 or 99% of the mass in a plant is carbon. That's why plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen for us, right? Opposite of humans, opposite of animals. Plants' mass is made up of carbon. So, okay, number one, all oil was once above ground in the form of plants and animals. Number two, plants are made up purely of carbon. What happens when we use fossil fuels? It releases carbon dioxide into the air. So if we know that plants use carbon to create their own mass, the logical conclusion of that would be that more carbon dioxide in the air would result in more and larger plant life. And in fact, when you look at how biology works, that is exactly what happens. In fact, when you go into greenhouses, that's why it's called the greenhouse effect, because when you go into greenhouses and you increase the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the air in there, it improves the plant life. It makes them bigger, makes them larger. It makes it much easier to grow plants. So now let's take a step back and try to put these pieces together. We've got a lot of oil under the ground. At one time, it was plant and animal life. Plants are made of carbon dioxide. So we would think then if we looked back at history, we would be able to find a period of time in history where there was a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and number two, a much greater abundance of plant and animal life on Earth than compared to today. And in fact, when we go to the historical charts, this one's from earth.org, we can see here that that is exactly what we find. Right here on the right side of this chart, we can see the projections of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere moving forward. Right now, we're down here, and we can see that in the past, we had much, much higher parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than we do today. In fact, today we can see that we stand at about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. However, in Earth's history, we were up to 9,000 parts per million. That's over 20 times higher than where we are at today. And in fact, when we look at prehistoric records, fossil records, we know that plant and animal life was far more abundant back then than it is today. Again, carbon dioxide is plant food. More plant food results in bigger and more plants, results in bigger and more animals. Now you think, well, what about the temperature? It must have been hot on Earth at that time. And exactly, it was. If you take a look at this chart, we can see that we are much cooler today than we were in these prehistoric times, where the carbon dioxide level was much higher than it is today. Yes, it's a greenhouse effect. It results in the greening of the Earth. That's why it's called a greenhouse. So more carbon equals more plants equals more animals equals a greening abundance on Earth of plant and animal food, which is human thriving and animal thriving and plant life thriving. And you think, well, why do they say with 2 degrees or 3 degrees increase in temperature, it's going to make the entire world a desert? It's completely false. In fact, we know looking at deserts right now, they're deserts right now because of the temperature of the Earth being too cool. If you were to increase the temperature of the Sahara Desert, you would turn it into a rainforest. How do we know this? Because it used to be a rainforest. If you look at the records, the fossil records in that area, we know unequivocally for a fact it used to be a rainforest, a tropical rainforest, where there was abundant plant and animal life when the Earth was warmer. Because a warmer temperature on Earth evaporates the water from the oceans, causes more rains, makes it easier for plant and animal life because of the higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and it will green the Earth, warm up the parts that are too cold, bring more water to the places that are too dry. It is unequivocally a good thing for the Earth to have higher CO2 levels in our atmosphere. So again, if you would like to learn more about this, I highly recommend the book Fossil Future by Alex Epstein. And this is why I am so excited about the recent EPA ruling by the Supreme Court, because number one, it means potential for more freedom and liberty for individuals, people like you and I, moving forward into the future. That there is less ability for unelected officials in these bureaucratic organizations that Congress has abdicated its responsibility to make laws that affect the everyday lives of people like you and me. And it means that Congress, the people who are accountable to being voted in and out of office, are the ones that have to make those decisions. And number two, it means that we have the ability to create more wealth, because wealth is tightly correlated with energy consumption, and arbitrary limits on what kind of energy you can use result in less energy, which means less wealth. And number three, it means a better environment, both from a protection standpoint. We get to green our Earth. We can improve the amount of animal and plant life on our Earth. Again, through the lens of for human benefit. Protect it, nurture it, keep it, and improve it for our benefit. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.